The nervous system scans both our internal environment and our external environment. Our external, the look on your partner's face, the noise behind you, and that internal environment, increase in your heart rate, trembling in your muscles. If the brain detects a threat, it will initiate a threat response, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn via the nervous system. And once this response is activated, it continues to signal our body into this state of stress to our brain until this perceived threat has ended. Welcome to the Sober Edge podcast, inspiration for alcohol-free living. I'm your host, Teri Patterson, functional nutritionist and This Naked Mind senior coach. The Sober Edge is a place to explore the infinite possibilities on the other side of drinking. In a culture soaked in booze, discover the wonder and joy of taking a different path. Meet real people living lives of purpose and passion. Learn the truth behind the alcohol myths and get ready to be motivated, inspired, and astounded by what is possible with the Sober Edge. Well, hey everyone, it's Teri back with another edition of the Sober Edge podcast. And today I am delighted to talk a little bit more about understanding your nervous system. And this is going to be perhaps familiar to many of you, but also, I hope, just a little bit deeper dive into the definitions that we have around some very familiar terms: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And I realized recently that we talk about these four responses within our nervous system without really defining them. And I think we're guilty, me as well, all of us, many of us, of, talking about these things without checking in with each other that we really understand, or even doing a little research on our own to make sure that what we are sharing is actually uh, helpful when it comes to truly understanding your nervous system. And so I recently shared these concepts in a coaching call, and I further defined not just fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, but the way that alcohol was keeping us in these loops, or why alcohol was helpful as we use these nervous system patterns to get through our lives and to really understand that there are things we can learn from the coping skills that we used in the past. And as we move away from alcohol, how are these patterns still showing up? And can we learn from that? So, first, just to talk a little bit about our nervous system. And some of this comes from the work of Dr. Nicole LaPera, the holistic psychologist. And I use her work and share her work with all gratitude, because she allows people to do this so that we can just together understand more about our nervous system. And she talks about this concept of neuroception. And so we know that our body is wired for safety, and we are constantly doing threat assessment. We're constantly, with our nervous system, assessing our environment and sending information to our brain. And this happens through an unconscious process called neuroception. What we feel helps our brain determine whether our environment is safe or dangerous. And what's really interesting is how we perceive our environment has more to do with the familiar than whether it is actually safe or not, because our brain craves familiarity. It wants to create meaning. And so often familiar things feel safe, even when they're not as safe for us or healthy in terms of how we're coping and getting by. And so, the nervous system scans both our internal environment and our external environment. Our external, the look on your partner's face, the noise behind you, and that internal environment, increase in your heart rate, trembling in your muscles. If the brain detects a threat, it will initiate a threat response, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn via the nervous system. And once this response is activated, it continues to signal our body into this state of stress to our brain until this perceived threat has ended. And so, what's really happening is through the process of neuroception, a stressed out body will unconsciously continue to scan its environment for stress until we move out of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, that sympathetic system, and into a parasympathetic system. And so I want to define now fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so I want to share with you just some concepts around it and some behavioral signs, how it shows up in our body, and how each of these different responses can be connected to our alcohol free journey. So let's start with fight, probably the most familiar. And this is a state of activation. So the way it shows up in our behavior, it can be anger, irritability, defensiveness. This is often where we are needing to control people or outcomes. So I found this very interesting because as someone who likes to control things, I wonder now if some of this is from these patterns of fight. If this is my nervous system feeling threatened and wanting to control people or outcomes. Fight behavioral signs can also look like outbursts or explosive emotions, blaming, arguing, or pushing back. And so in the body, the way this often shows up is we find our jaw is tense, our fists are tense. Maybe we've clenched our muscles. We might feel heat or a flush in the chest or face. Our breathing is often shallow or rapid. So if you have experienced these before, this is your body, the way that it is experiencing a response to a threat in our environment or internal. And we are trying to fight against this. Our nervous system is on high alert. And so it's really interesting to think about the alcohol and alcohol free connection. So often, a response to feeling unheard or powerless is when we find ourselves in fight. And it's interesting to note that alcohol may have softened this intensity or sometimes given an outlet for rage. If you have ever felt like, well, alcohol is the only time when I'm inebriated or under the influence that I can tell my partner off or say what I really think or write that angry email. And so this is really powerful to recognize that we have sometimes used alcohol in this fight stage because it gives us a response to that feeling of being unheard or an opportunity or even permission to have an outlet for the rage that we feel. And so the next time you start to recognize that you're in fight, I invite you to consider, what's going on in my body? What am I noticing about my responses and experience? What are the patterns that I can recognize now that maybe when I was drinking and over drinking, I didn't understand? And for me personally, it's been fascinating to go a little deeper here and think about the ways that my automatic responses would come up in these situations. And alcohol played not just a role in creating, me wanting to fight back, but again, sometimes in that really interesting place of permission. The second and probably second most familiar part of this is the flight. And again, flight is part action, right? So we see these behavioral signs. And listen, because some of these are really interesting. I would not have thought that this was a nervous system response or that I was in flight. So I'm so excited to share this with you and see if you maybe have some new awareness. So behavioral signs of flight, restlessness, anxiety, perfectionism. Isn't that interesting? Overworking or staying quote unquote busy, difficulty relaxing or being still, obsessive thinking or catastrophizing. Isn't that interesting? So for me, as I was putting this information together and recognizing some of my patterns, this is the one that I think I spent most of my time in this pattern of flight. And so in the body, it can look like a racing heart, a tight chest, tingling in your limbs like an urge to run. And for me, this showed up a lot, GI distress or nausea. And so I was one of those people who, after I stopped drinking, it took me a while to realize that I wasn't the only person that used alcohol to turn off my brain. And so that difficulty relaxing, being still. And I was doing a lot of catastrophizing. I wasn't even aware of it until alcohol was out of the picture. And so, this alcohol and alcohol free connection, many women may have used or may be using alcohol to slow down our racing thoughts or to escape the constant pressure to do more and be more. Isn't that fascinating? I find so many women in the work that I do that, yes, they're actually in flight so much more than they realize. And it is this nervous system regulation pattern of trying to understand, what's going on, what feels threatening. And it feels threatening sometimes to not feel like we're enough, that we're not showing up, that people don't see that we're under a lot of pressure. And so we get into this flight response. And we can stay here a long time until we do this deeper work. And as you know, for me and many of the women I work with, this deeper work isn't even really accessible until alcohol is out of the way. And so now I want to talk about the freeze state and the fawn state. These, I think, are newer in our language when it comes to understanding our sympathetic system. And I don't think they're as well defined. So I hope this is helpful today. So when we look at freeze, we see behavior signs such as numbness, zoning out, feeling disconnected. It can show up as inability to make decisions. And this one's really interesting, shame spiral. Withdrawing or shutting down emotionally is also another behavioral sign. So, unlike fight or flight, this freeze state is not about action. It's about shutting down, disassociating. And the shame spiral, we'll talk a little bit more about that. In the body, we see heaviness or limpness, cold extremities, shallow breathing, or even holding your breath, and a foggy or blank mind. This is the freeze state. And so alcohol often served as a way to check out, right? To avoid things that were going on, I know I used it to avoid difficult conversations, to avoid hard things that were happening in my world, my family, my marriage. And so freeze is the original disassociation. And what is so powerful about when we begin this alcohol-free journey is that removing alcohol may bring this freeze state to the surface, and it often does. And so what we see is that we're suddenly coming back out of that numbness. We're becoming alive. And for many of the clients I work with, I see that I have a coach friend who talks about this as defrosting. And it's true, right? When you defrost something, it's thawing out. And so here we are in freeze, and the defrosting can look like crying, sighing, laughing, more emotions, if you have been frozen, if you've been in a state where you have been kind of stuck in this freeze pattern, coming back to yourself is beautiful and it can be hard. And so this just defrosting period is really, really significant. So I invite you to recognize if this might be you. And then the last one that I want to define is something even I didn't really understand thoroughly until I was putting this talk together. And so fawn. So fawn is the root of people pleasing, avoiding conflict, over apologizing. Does anyone else notice how, as women, we are so quick to apologize for things that are not our fault, for things, states in the state of the world, all kinds of things that, we tend to over apologize. And fawn often looks like merging with others' needs and losing our own identity. And so, really, it is that term like to fawn over someone, fawning over someone, being overly solicited, merging our needs, letting go of what we need, and just putting all of our attention on the other person. And so many women that I work with recognize or share that part of their drinking story and over drinking story was people pleasing. And so one of their goals is to get out of this fawning pattern of how we respond to threats in our environment and learn how to stop being a people pleaser. So in the body, this might show up as tension in the shoulders or the throat, which is really interesting. The throat, if we think about the chakras and we think about Eastern medicine and we think about how, oh, our throat, when we are afraid to use our voice, we can feel tension in our throat. And we might show up in the body with softened voice or hesitant speech. Again, kind of afraid to speak up, avoiding conflict. And then our tummy might feel that hollow or fluttery stomach. And so, if we look at alcohol and alcohol free living, this connection is that alcohol helped or helps many women mask their truth or stay likable. I've talked to a lot of women that have identified as wearing a mask during their drinking days, and that putting on that mask allowed them to get through these places where they felt threatened and their nervous system was coming up with a response. And as we reclaim our voice and our boundaries, fawn often comes up to be healed. And so I think the beautiful thing about all of these nervous system responses is that they are places where we can recognize where we feel threatened. And so, in our environment, if something triggers us and we do go into one of these patterns, now we have the opportunity to bring awareness to that and to question, what is feeling threatening in my environment? Where am I shying away or shrinking back or wanting to fight back or feeling rage? What's really going on here beneath the surface? What is that trigger or experience or circumstance that is creating this pattern? And I think there's so much growth we can do when we understand a little bit more about, showing up in our parasympathetic and our ventral vagal, right? And so one of the things I've been studying lately is the polyvagal theory, and I'll be doing some more work on this in the fall. And so we see that the parasympathetic, right, that rest and digest state is part of our ventral vagal. And then our sympathetic and our freeze and our fawn response, they are, these places where we are in dorsal vagal or sympathetic. And fawn response is actually blended between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So, super interesting to just kind of think about the patterns that we use when we feel dysregulated, uncomfortable. And, it's really powerful to start to explore for yourself what happens when you are in that disassociated state. What is going on that's creating it? What is the awareness around it? And how do we move through it? And one of the most powerful things to know is that in order to move through it, we not only use our brain, but we must use our body. We must start to help our body calm down, slow down, take breaths, release some of this tension that is activated when we are in either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So there's so much awareness that we can bring to this conversation around the patterns that we see. And again, I believe the most powerful work is done when alcohol is out of the way. That's when we can start to notice the patterns that we're using because, as I mentioned, in each of these four states, alcohol often has shown up as a tool. Remember, in fight, it can look like a way to give us an outlet for our rage. In flight, it can be a way to slow down our racing thoughts. In freeze, it can help us stay disassociated, that protective response. And then in fawn, alcohol can help us mask our truth. And so, what is available to us when we move away from alcohol? We can actually recognize that we have healthy ways to speak our truth. We have other healthy coping tools to slow down our brain. We have ways to stop disassociating and get in touch with what we're really feeling and feel safe doing it. And we can stop showing up with our only intention to be likable, and we can start to feel comfortable in our own skin. So, more to come as I learn more about the polyvagal theory and do my course on nervous system regulation. But I wanted to just introduce this today because, again, I think that sometimes we are guilty as coaches and people who are sharing more about this work of not actually defining what it means and the ways that alcohol impacts our journey. So I hope that you found this helpful. And I want to just give a huge shout out if you are, in fact, on your own alcohol free journey and discovering how to notice what's happening in your nervous system, get out of that hypervigilance, and start to do some of this deeper work that is so, so important. All right, well, that's what I have for you today. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you soon. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Sober Edge podcast. This is a place for important conversations and a safe place to question everything you thought you knew about drinking. If you're looking for your sober edge, I want to invite you to connect with me at thesobernutritionist.com, where you can grab my free resource, Becoming More, a guide to loving your sober life. And I would be so grateful if you enjoyed this podcast, if you would leave a rating and review, as it will help more people find their sober edge.